Isn't it strange to be attending a speech class while staring at our computer screens, often alone in a space? As technology continues to advance, our interactions with each other have started to evolve into a new mode of communication, a type of unified language on the internet. The infamy speech was one of the most impactful of the early years of presidential radio speeches which took place throughout the 20th century. These speeches marked a dramatic shift in the rhetorical situation between a president and his constituents. Franklin Roosevelt, or FDR, was an expert at making use of the latest technologies to deliver his message directly to the people and bring them together in support of numerous revolutionary policies and programs. He won his position in office during a time of great upheaval and struggle. In Smith's book, FDR, I learned of his first 100 days plan, under which his administration sought to address the Great Depression, which had seen the U.S. face 4 years of financial struggle with vast levels of unemployment, to institute policies of financial reform, and introduce agencies of enforcement and insurances on private holdings with financial institutions across the nation, as per Kennedy. And lastly, to establish the Public Works Administration, to provide jobs and improve infrastructure. These improvements to the economy from his policies saw a 1936 landslide re-election and nationwide support for his leadership. 4 years later, with World War II only a year underway, no one knew if FDR would run for an unprecedented third term, which wasn't yet explicitly forbidden by the Constitution. His support was waning in the popular vote, but his commitment to stay out of the war won him the 1940 election. Sainsbury wrote a book of his secret efforts, which had started before U.S. official involvement in the war with Churchill to restore peace in Europe under the Atlantic Charter. At the time, he was spoken of as the only person who could lead America through the war. His administration enacted Lend-Lease to provide all aid short of war to Allied nations. FDR had long planned to be the arsenal of democracy, and again under Kennedy, I learned that from 1940 to 1944, the U.S. sent over 40 million rounds of ammunition and 20 million weapons to Allied forces. Even so, initially it was a struggle to garner support against the America First platform when trying to rearm America's armed forces with the transportation and equipment they would need to win the war. Despite all the opposition, he grew the army from 200,000 men in 1939 to over 1.4 million by mid-1941. Citing public records widely available now, we know that the Roosevelt administration had hoped Japan would strike first to draw America into the war, but wanted to minimize the death toll and impact of such an attack. They theorized that the attack would happen in the West Pacific. Having been caught by the surprise attack, Roosevelt was forced to write the speech himself and deliver it less than a day after the news had broken of the attack. His speech starts out stating that the United States of America was attacked by the Empire of Japan on a date that will live in infamy. Of note is that at the time, Hawaii was still a territory of the United States and hadn't yet been granted statehood. FDR knew that not all Americans would have been apprised of the developing diplomatic situation with Japan. He spoke of recent communications which provided no indication that such an attack was imminent, or that the current state of peace between the nations was at risk of total dissolution. He was careful to speak of the great number of American lives lost and vast damage to ships and infrastructure, but not provide exact or even rough numbers out of respect for the sacrifice that the American armed forces and civilians had suffered in the surprise attack. He then transitions into what Hall would describe as an anaphoric cycle of listing the sites of other attacks that Japan commenced subsequent to Pearl Harbor. The impact of his repetition is strong and demonstrates an urgent need for swift and powerful response from the U.S. government across the entire Pacific region. All points of attack he mentions are either American or Allied territories. He needs the support of American Congress to declare a state of war, so this is no place to mention that our nation's sanctions against Japan have reduced their access to oil by over 95% and may have indeed predicated the attack in the first place. His words are carefully chosen, and while they may seem dry to the modern ear, FDR was known for providing calming reassurance with his weekly radio fireside addresses to the nation. Much of the speech is even-toned and restrained, but the force and emotion in his voice is palpable when he declares, "The American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory." It was his confidence, surely, that saw Congress declare war on Japan within just half an hour of the message being delivered, and with only a single dissenting vote. Even so, it's the infamy line that is remembered throughout the time, and sometimes without the context even. But in fact, this speaks to the impact it has, as we know it is meaningful, even if we were not direct witness to the horrific events of that fateful December. Finally, although FDR didn't live to see the end of the war, there is no doubt that we couldn't have seen ourselves through it without his leadership. FDR wasn't a perfect leader. He made mistakes in his administration, as most presidents do. But he was one of the most influential of our time, and certainly of the 20th century. Through his mastery of public appearance and mass appeal, the bounty he provided for this nation is the reason his name and face remain enshrined across the many miles of interstates of our states and territories and on our currency alongside the founding fathers. I encourage you, my fellow student, to use the same technology on which you view this speech today, to seek out lists like the 10 most famous speeches and review them to expose yourself to the messages from some of the world's most impactful leaders, many of whom made direct use of the modern technology to impart great change on their nations, just as FDR did for ours.